HOA operated a private airstrip on my land for 4 years. I found out when a plane landed in my field. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we jump into today's incredible story, I have one small favor to ask. If you enjoy stories about justice, unexpected twists, and unforgettable moments, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It is completely free, takes only a few seconds, and your support helps us continue bringing you powerful stories inspired by real-life conflicts and hard-earned victories. We truly appreciate every single one of you. Before we begin, let us know where you are watching from by leaving your city or country in the comments. We love seeing viewers from all around the world, and your messages make this community even more special. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. Now, without any further delay, let us return to our main character and begin today's story. I always believed that if a stranger knew more about your property than you did, something had already gone terribly wrong. The first sign that my life was about to change forever came on an unusually clear Saturday morning in late September. The air smelled like fresh-cut hay mixed with dry Texas soil, and the only sounds drifting across my ranch were the steady chirping of meadowlarks and the distant hum of cattle grazing behind a weathered fence my grandfather had repaired more times than I could remember. I had driven out before sunrise to inspect a section of fencing along the north pasture, something I had postponed for weeks because work kept pulling me across the state. As a civil engineer, my projects rarely left room for long weekends at the ranch I had inherited from my grandfather, and although I visited whenever I could, I always believed the land would still be waiting for me exactly as I had left it. I was wrong. At first, I thought the growing sound above me was another crop duster passing toward a neighboring county. Small airplanes weren't unusual in rural Texas, and I barely looked up as the engine noise became louder. Then the sound changed. Instead of fading into the distance, it dropped lower. Much lower. I looked toward the northern field just in time to watch a single-engine airplane descend over my property with complete confidence, its wheels touching the grass less than 300 yards away. Dust rolled behind it, as if the pilot had landed there 100 times before. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. There wasn't supposed to be any runway on my ranch. There never had been. Yet the airplane rolled forward in a perfectly straight line before slowing to an easy stop near a patch of open ground that somehow looked strangely organized. Before I could even begin walking toward it, the pilot climbed out with a smile that immediately made me question my own understanding of the place I had owned for nearly 5 years. He waved as if greeting an old friend. "Morning," he called. "Where do you want me parked?" "I've got another plane coming in about 15 minutes. I stared at him, honestly wondering whether he had mistaken me for someone else. "I'm sorry," I answered. "What did you just say?" He laughed politely, probably assuming I had not heard him over the engine. "Parking," he repeated. "Should I leave her over here until lunch, or are you expecting more arrivals?" "More arrivals?" The words echoed in my head harder than the airplane's engine ever could. I looked across my own pasture, suddenly noticing details that had never registered before. The grass directly ahead of the airplane looked flatter than the surrounding field. 2 narrow rows of evenly spaced posts stretched farther down the pasture than I remembered. There were strips of white paint on weathered boards lying almost flush with the ground. Nothing looked brand new, but nothing looked accidental either. It looked maintained, deliberately maintained. The pilot followed my eyes before giving me a puzzled expression. "Everything okay?" he asked. "You guys usually have volunteers directing traffic during the fall fly-ins." My stomach tightened. "Who exactly are you guys?" He frowned for the first time. "Willow Creek Estates," he answered without hesitation. "The neighborhood runs this airstrip. They've been doing it for years." I slowly turned toward the subdivision, sitting just beyond a line of oak trees bordering the eastern edge of my ranch. Houses that hadn't existed when my grandfather was alive now stretched across what had once been open grazing land, their rooftops glowing beneath the rising Texas sun. I had watched that subdivision grow one phase at a time over the years, but never once imagined anyone there believed they owned a piece of my family's history. Standing there with dust still hanging in the morning air and another airplane engine beginning to rumble somewhere beyond the horizon, I realized I was no longer looking at an isolated misunderstanding. I was standing in the middle of a story that had apparently been unfolding for years without me ever knowing it. I kept looking from the pilot to the subdivision as if one of them would suddenly admit this was some elaborate misunderstanding. Instead, the man simply walked around his airplane, checking the tires and wiping a few bugs from the leading edge of the wing with the relaxed routine of someone visiting a familiar place. Nothing about his behavior suggested he believed he was trespassing. If anything, I looked like the confused outsider standing on my own property. "How long have people been landing here?" I finally asked. He shrugged without even looking up. "For years, maybe a little longer. Ever since Willow Creek opened the executive air access for residents and guests." "For years." I repeated the number silently, trying to match it with my own memories. 4 years earlier was about the same time my engineering firm had started taking on larger transportation projects across Texas. I had spent weeks at a time away from the ranch, sometimes living out of hotels while supervising bridge inspections and roadway construction. I still came home whenever I could, but most of my visits focused on the southern grazing fields, the equipment barn, and the main house where my grandfather had lived until the end of his life. The north pasture rarely demanded attention. It had always been open grassland used for seasonal grazing, nearly half a mile from the house and hidden behind a line of mature oak trees. That distance, combined with my work schedule, had quietly created the perfect blind spot. My grandfather, Samuel Holloway, had purchased the ranch in 1969 with money he saved after decades of hard work. He treated every acre as if it were another member of the family. He believed land deserved respect because it remembered every decision made upon it. When he passed the ranch down to me, he also passed down that responsibility. I had promised myself I would protect everything he spent a lifetime building. Yet standing there that morning, I felt as though I had failed him without even realizing it. The pilot finally closed the inspection panel and smiled again. "You must be new around here," he said. "The neighborhood hosts some great fly-ins. Families come out with lawn chairs. Food trucks usually set up over there." He pointed directly toward the center of my pasture. I followed his finger in disbelief. Food trucks, families, events, on my land. Before I could ask another question, the distant engine I had heard earlier became louder until another small airplane appeared above the trees. It lined up with the exact same approach path and descended with remarkable precision. My pulse quickened as I stepped farther back, watching the second aircraft touch down almost exactly where the first one had landed. Whatever existed here was not an occasional accident. It was an organized operation. After both pilots exchanged friendly waves, I climbed into my pickup truck and drove toward the ranch house, my thoughts racing faster than the tires over the gravel road. There was only one person who might know something I did not. Walter Jenkins had worked alongside my grandfather for decades before becoming the caretaker after I inherited the ranch. If anyone had watched this place while I was away, it was Walter. 20 minutes later, I found him repairing a section of fence near the equipment shed. He smiled the moment he saw me, but the expression faded as soon as he noticed the look on my face. Before he could even ask what was wrong, I interrupted him with the question that had been echoing in my mind since the first airplane rolled across my pasture. "Walter," I said quietly, "why are airplanes landing on our land like they have every right to be there?" Walter leaned both hands on the top rail of the fence and stared at me for several long seconds before letting out a slow breath. "So you finally saw them," he said quietly. That was not the answer I expected. "Finally," I repeated. He nodded with an expression that looked more uncomfortable than defensive. "I figured you already knew." The neighborhood acted like there was some kind of agreement. They were respectful most of the time, kept things tidy, and never crossed into the cattle pastures. "I thought maybe you had leased that section years ago and just never mentioned it." I felt my jaw tighten, but I could not blame Walter for believing what everyone else apparently believed. He had watched over this ranch for decades because my grandfather trusted him like family, and I trusted him the same way. If the entire subdivision behaved as though everything had been officially approved, there was no obvious reason for him to question it. "Did you ever see paperwork?" I asked. Walter slowly shook his head. "No, just people acting like everything was legitimate." That answer bothered me even more. Assumptions had somehow replaced facts. I climbed back into my truck and headed toward the north pasture again, determined to look at my own land with fresh eyes instead of relying on memory. The closer I got, the more details began revealing themselves. Along both sides of the landing area stood short solar-powered runway lights mounted on weathered metal stakes. They were low enough to avoid attracting attention from a distance, yet perfectly spaced to guide approaching aircraft. A narrow gravel access lane connected the pasture to a service gate leading toward Willow Creek Estates. Fresh tire tracks crossed the gravel, and the grass around the entrance had recently been trimmed. None of it looked temporary. Someone had invested time, money, and regular maintenance into making this place function like a permanent private airstrip. I parked and walked the length of the landing area, counting my steps out of habit. Years of engineering work had trained my eyes to notice grading, drainage, and surface preparation. The ground beneath my boots felt noticeably firmer than the surrounding pasture. Sections had clearly been compacted over time. Whoever maintained this strip understood enough about site preparation to keep small aircraft operating safely. Near the service gate, I found a wooden sign mounted beside the fence. The paint had faded slightly under the Texas sun, but the lettering remained perfectly readable. Willow Creek Executive Air Access. Beneath it sat a smaller plaque thanking community volunteers for their continued support of neighborhood aviation events. I took several photographs before continuing toward the subdivision entrance. Just inside the gate stood a weatherproof community bulletin board covered with announcements and newsletters. One laminated issue immediately caught my attention. Across the top was a large photograph of smiling residents gathered around a ribbon stretched across the very pasture where I had watched airplanes land only hours earlier. Standing in the center of the picture was a well-dressed woman holding ceremonial scissors while applauding neighbors surrounded her. The caption beneath the photograph read, "President Victoria Whitmore celebrates the grand opening of Willow Creek Executive Air Access." My eyes moved slowly across every line of the article. It described the airstrip as one of the community's greatest amenities and thanked volunteers who had spent months improving the property for residents and visiting pilots. Not one sentence mentioned an easement, a lease, or permission from the actual owner. I lowered the newsletter and looked back across the open field where another airplane sat quietly beneath the morning sun. For the first time, I realized this was no longer about a few pilots making an honest mistake. An entire neighborhood had built its own version of reality on land that had belonged to my family for more than half a century, and somehow nobody had ever stopped to ask who actually owned it. I drove into Willow Creek Estates that afternoon with the windows down and my pickup coated in a thin layer of ranch dust, hoping nobody would pay much attention to another truck passing through the neighborhood. The entrance monument featured polished stone walls, carefully trimmed hedges, and a decorative sign welcoming residents and guests. Everything about the subdivision projected order and prosperity. Children rode bicycles along quiet streets. Retirees walked their dogs beneath rows of young maple trees, and neighbors waved at one another with the comfortable familiarity of people who believed they lived in an exceptionally well-managed community. Nothing about the place suggested deception. That was what unsettled me most. Everyone seemed completely convinced they were participating in something perfectly legitimate. I parked near the clubhouse and walked inside without introducing myself. The lobby resembled a small museum dedicated to local aviation. Framed photographs covered one entire wall, showing smiling families posing beside single-engine airplanes, weekend cookouts, charity fly-ins, and community celebrations held beside the same stretch of pasture that legally belonged to my family. A large display case held model airplanes, commemorative plaques, and framed newspaper clippings celebrating the neighborhood's unique identity. Several visitors admired the exhibits while chatting casually about upcoming aviation events. I listened without interrupting. One older resident proudly explained to another couple that the private airstrip had become the subdivision's signature attraction and had even increased home values over the past few years. His confidence was absolute. I continued farther into the building until I reached the reception desk, where a friendly employee greeted me with a warm smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. I smiled back. I was curious about the airstrip I saw on my way in. It seems unusually well organized. Her expression brightened immediately. "It is one of our greatest community amenities. Residents absolutely love it. We host seasonal fly-ins, charity breakfasts, and guest arrivals throughout the year." "Who owns the runway?" I asked as casually as possible. She answered without the slightest hesitation. "The association manages everything." There was no uncertainty in her voice, no pause to reconsider the answer. She believed it. Completely. Before I could continue, Movement near the conference room caught my attention. A woman stepped into the hallway wearing a tailored navy blazer, greeting residents by name as they stopped to speak with her. She carried herself with quiet confidence, smiling easily while answering questions about landscaping projects, upcoming meetings, and neighborhood improvements. I recognized her immediately from the newsletter photograph. Victoria Whitmore. She looked exactly like someone people trusted to make important decisions. Moments later, a large community map mounted beside the conference room became the center of an informal conversation. Victoria walked over and pointed toward the eastern edge of the subdivision while explaining future plans to several homeowners. From where I stood, I could clearly see the map included the airstrip as a permanent neighborhood feature. The shaded illustration extended beyond the subdivision boundary and incorporated a section of land that I knew belonged to my ranch. Nobody questioned it. Nobody appeared uncertain. They simply accepted the map as reality because it had been hanging there for years. I watched the conversation for several more minutes before quietly leaving the clubhouse. Sitting behind the wheel of my truck, I resisted every impulse to walk back inside and announce exactly who I was. Confronting anyone now would accomplish nothing except give them time to prepare explanations before I understood the full story myself. My grandfather had always repeated the same advice whenever emotions threatened good judgment. Facts first, words later. As I started the engine and drove toward the county courthouse, I realized that if everyone in Willow Creek believed the same story, then the only thing capable of separating truth from assumption would be official records, and I intended to read every single one of them. The county courthouse sat only 20 minutes from my ranch, but the drive felt much longer because every mile gave my mind another chance to imagine explanations that might somehow make sense of what I had witnessed. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, I had already considered dozens of possibilities. Maybe my grandfather had signed an agreement I had never seen. Maybe an easement had been recorded years before I inherited the property. Maybe there was a boundary adjustment buried somewhere inside county records. I kept searching for a reasonable answer because the alternative was almost impossible to believe. Inside the records office, the familiar smell of old paper and polished wood immediately reminded me of previous visits involving engineering projects and land surveys. I approached the counter, introduced myself, and requested every document connected to my ranch parcel. The clerk asked for my property identification number, typed for a few moments, and then disappeared into the back office before returning with both digital records and archived files. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing deeds, tax records, parcel maps, and ownership history one document at a time. Every page told exactly the same story. My grandfather purchased the ranch in 1969. Ownership transferred legally to me after his passing. Property taxes had been paid every single year without interruption. The legal description had never changed. The northern pasture remained entirely within my boundary. There was no recorded easement, no lease, no right of access, no aviation agreement, nothing. I asked the clerk if there had ever been any amendment affecting the northern section of the property. She searched again using additional records before calmly shaking her head. Everything appears exactly as it has for decades, she said. There are no recorded changes involving that parcel. I thanked her and carried copies of the documents to the county planning office down the hall. A planning specialist reviewed the subdivision plats for Willow Creek Estates while I watched over his shoulder. Colored maps showed every phase of development approved over the years. Streets, drainage easements, utility corridors, common areas, and lot boundaries were all clearly labeled. When he reached the eastern edge of the subdivision, the neighborhood stopped precisely where my ranch began. There was no extension into my pasture, no community airstrip, no shared recreational space. The official subdivision simply ended at my property line. Has anyone ever submitted plans for an airfield out there? I asked. He searched the planning database before answering. Not that I can find. If there had been a formal application involving your parcel, there would normally be supporting documentation. That answer removed another possible explanation. Before leaving the courthouse, I stopped by the county sheriff's office hoping someone might offer practical guidance. After listening carefully, the deputy remained professional and respectful. He explained that property ownership itself was not in dispute because the county records clearly identified me as the owner. However, Determining responsibility for unauthorized use of private land would likely require civil legal action rather than immediate criminal enforcement. It was not the dramatic answer people often expect, but it matched the calm reality of how these situations are usually handled. As I stepped outside into the afternoon sunshine, my phone vibrated with a message from Walter. He had attached a photograph taken only minutes earlier. Another small airplane was parked in my pasture, while two volunteers wearing bright safety vests guided visitors toward folding tables beside the landing area. I stared at the image for several silent moments before looking back at the folder of county records in my hands. Every official office had confirmed exactly the same thing, yet the activity on my land continued as though those records had never existed. At that moment, I realized there was only one place left to search for the piece everyone else seemed to be missing. My grandfather had never thrown away an important document, and somewhere inside the old ranch house, I suspected he had already preserved the answer years before anyone at Willow Creek believed the story they had been telling themselves. That evening, I unlocked the door to my grandfather's study for the first time in months, and the familiar scent of aged paper, cedar wood, and machine oil settled over the room like a memory that had been patiently waiting for me to return. Almost nothing had changed since the day I inherited the ranch. His heavy oak desk still faced the same window overlooking the southern pasture, and the tall filing cabinets along the back wall remained carefully labeled in his neat handwriting. My grandfather believed organization was another form of respect, especially when it came to land. He used to tell me that fences could fall, signs could disappear, and memories could fade, but good records would outlive all of them. At the time, I thought he was simply an old rancher who liked paperwork. Now those words sounded less like advice and more like preparation. I pulled open the first filing cabinet and found decades of neatly arranged folders sorted by year. There were tax receipts, equipment warranties, livestock records, rainfall logs, and correspondence with county offices stretching back farther than I expected. Everything had its place. Nearly an hour passed before I reached a drawer labeled property surveys and boundary records. My pulse quickened as I carried the folders to the desk and carefully unfolded the first large survey map. The heavy paper crackled softly beneath my hands. Every property corner, fence line, creek crossing, and survey monument had been measured with remarkable precision. The northern pasture where the airplanes now landed was clearly outlined inside the ranch boundary exactly as the county records had shown earlier that day. I continued searching and uncovered another folder containing aerial photographs taken decades apart. The oldest image showed nothing but open ranchland surrounding my grandfather's house. Later photographs documented the gradual construction of roads and homes as Willow Creek estates expanded toward our eastern property line. In every image, however, the subdivision stopped at the exact same boundary. The pasture never became part of the neighborhood. It never changed ownership. It never even changed shape. Beneath the photographs rested several handwritten letters exchanged between my grandfather and a licensed surveyor during the early planning stages of the subdivision. The surveyor thanked him for allowing temporary access to verify nearby property corners before reminding him to protect the permanent boundary monuments because future development could create confusion if they were disturbed. That sentence immediately caught my attention. I grabbed a flashlight and drove into the fading evening light toward the northern pasture. Following the survey map step by step, I searched along the fence until I located the first steel survey monument exactly where the drawing indicated it should be. It remained firmly embedded in the ground despite decades of weather. I found another marker farther south, then a third near the old creek crossing. Every one of them matched the legal survey with remarkable accuracy. Using the same professional-grade global positioning system receiver I normally carried for engineering work, I recorded each coordinate and compared the results against the original survey. The digital measurements aligned almost perfectly with the historic documents. Then I overlaid the positions with current satellite imagery. The answer appeared on my screen with complete clarity. The entire landing strip, every solar runway light, every section of compacted ground, every access point, and every area used during the neighborhood fly-ins sat completely inside my family's property. There was no overlap. There was no uncertainty. There was no legal gray area waiting to be interpreted. I stood quietly beside one of the old survey monuments as the last sunlight disappeared behind the oak trees, realizing my grandfather had unknowingly left me everything I needed decades before this situation ever existed. The evidence was no longer based on memory or opinion. It was measurable, documented, and impossible to ignore. All that remained was proving it carefully enough that nobody could ever deny it again. I decided not to confront anyone. That surprised even Walter when I explained my plan the following morning over coffee in the equipment barn. He expected me to march straight into the Willow Creek clubhouse with copies of the surveys and demand immediate answers. Instead, I packed my camera equipment, my engineering-grade global positioning system receiver, a notebook, and several trail cameras into the back of my truck. My grandfather had spent his entire life teaching me that the strongest case was the one that never depended on emotion. If I challenged the homeowners association too early, they might remove signs, relocate equipment, or simply deny what had been happening. If I remained patient, they would continue treating my pasture exactly as they always had, and every ordinary day would quietly strengthen the truth. Over the next 3 weeks, I documented everything with the same methodical approach I used while inspecting bridges and transportation projects. Every morning before sunrise, I recorded the precise location of the runway lights using satellite coordinates. I photographed the compacted landing surface from fixed reference points so changes could be measured over time instead of relying on memory. I marked the permanent survey monuments on updated maps and compared every measurement against my grandfather's original records. Nothing varied by more than a fraction of an inch. The legal boundary had remained exactly where it had always been. The activity surrounding it had not. I installed several trail cameras overlooking the landing area from locations that remained entirely on my property. Their purpose was simple. They recorded dates, times, maintenance vehicles, arriving aircraft, volunteers, and every routine activity taking place on the pasture. Within days, hundreds of images began filling the memory cards. Pickup trucks towing lawn equipment entered through the service gate to mow the landing strip. Volunteers inspected the solar runway lights before weekend arrivals. Small airplanes landed with remarkable consistency, and visiting pilots greeted residents as though they were arriving at a long-established private facility. Nobody acted cautiously because nobody believed they were doing anything improper. That confidence became some of the strongest evidence I collected. During evenings, I searched local newspaper archives at the public library and through digital historical databases. The results surprised even me. Community newspapers had published articles celebrating annual neighborhood fly-ins, charity breakfasts, scholarship fundraisers, and aviation appreciation weekends held on the very pasture that county records identified as my family's land. One article even praised the Homeowners Association for creating one of the region's most distinctive neighborhood amenities. Another included a wide photograph of dozens of folding chairs arranged beside parked airplanes while children waved American flags near the landing area. Every published photograph unintentionally documented unauthorized use of the same property boundaries shown in my grandfather's surveys. I organized everything into labeled binders. One section contained certified county ownership records. Another held historical surveys and aerial photographs. A third included current satellite imagery with engineering measurements. Separate folders contained trail camera photographs, newspaper articles, community newsletters, and dated images of every runway light, sign, access lane, and improvement made by the association. By the end of the 3rd week, the evidence no longer told isolated stories. Together, the documents formed a complete timeline stretching from my grandfather's purchase of the ranch in 1969 through the construction of Willow Creek Estates and into the present day. The remarkable part was that none of it suggested a secret conspiracy. Instead, it revealed something much more believable. One incorrect assumption had gradually become accepted as fact, and once enough people repeated the same story, nobody stopped to verify it. As I closed the final binder late one evening, my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for the upcoming Willow Creek Autumn Fly-In, advertised as the largest aviation event of the year. For the first time since this began, I smiled. If the association intended to celebrate on my property one more weekend, they were about to provide the final piece of documentation I had been patiently waiting to collect. The morning of the Willow Creek Autumn Fly-In arrived with cool air, clear skies, and the unmistakable sound of anticipation spreading across the neighborhood before the first airplane ever appeared. I parked my truck on a section of my ranch overlooking the north pasture, well away from the activity, but close enough to document everything without interfering. My cameras were already positioned, my notebook lay open on the passenger seat, and every previous binder of evidence rested beside me. I was no longer searching for proof. I was simply allowing the final chapter to unfold exactly as everyone expected it would. By mid-morning, volunteers wearing matching community shirts unlocked the service gate and began directing traffic across the gravel access lane. Pickup trucks delivered folding tables, portable tents, and coolers filled with drinks. Families unfolded lawn chairs along the edge of the landing area, while children pointed excitedly toward the sky each time another airplane approached. One by one, small aircraft descended onto the compacted strip with the same confidence I had witnessed weeks earlier. Every arrival was quietly recorded by my cameras, complete with timestamps and location data. Nobody looked nervous. Nobody questioned whether they belonged there. They believed they were participating in a tradition that had become part of their community identity. Shortly before noon, I drove into town for a meeting that mattered far more than anything happening on the pasture. My appointment was with a real estate attorney whose practice focused almost entirely on boundary disputes, easements, and property rights. After introducing myself, I placed the first binder on the conference table, then the second, then the third. By the time I finished, nearly every available chair held carefully organized evidence collected over the previous several weeks. The attorney spent more than an hour reviewing county ownership records, historical surveys, global positioning system measurements, aerial photographs, newsletters, trail camera images, and archived newspaper articles. He rarely interrupted, occasionally making notes before moving to the next document. Finally, he closed the last binder, leaned back in his chair, and smiled with the calm confidence of someone who had seen many complicated cases become surprisingly simple because of good preparation. "You have done exactly what I wish every client would do," he said. "You gathered facts before opinions. Everything supports the same conclusion." Hearing those words brought a sense of relief I had not realized I needed. We immediately began preparing formal notice packages addressed to the Homeowners Association, its legal representative, and the appropriate county offices. Every packet contained certified copies of ownership records, surveys, aerial photographs, engineering measurements, and documentation establishing that the landing strip existed entirely within my property boundaries. The attorney insisted every delivery be sent by certified mail, so there would never be any dispute about who received the information or when it arrived. Late that afternoon, after the final signatures were complete, I returned to the ranch. The fly-in was winding down as volunteers folded tables and visiting pilots prepared for departure. From a distance, I watched one last airplane lift smoothly into the Texas sky, while the fading sunlight reflected across the solar runway lights that had quietly marked my pasture for years. Everything looked peaceful, almost ordinary. Yet I knew the routine everyone considered permanent had already reached its final day. The certified notices would begin arriving within the next 48 hours, and once the documented reality reached every responsible office, assumptions would no longer carry any weight. For 4 years, an entire neighborhood had relied on a story repeated often enough to become accepted as truth. Beginning the following week, that story would finally meet the records that had been waiting patiently inside my grandfather's filing cabinet all along. 48 hours later, the first certified delivery receipts began arriving, followed almost immediately by silence from Willow Creek. The cheerful newsletters stopped mentioning aviation events. The online community calendar quietly removed every reference to the runway. Nobody announced an emergency meeting. Nobody defended the airstrip in public. Instead, the confidence I had witnessed inside the clubhouse seemed to disappear overnight. My attorney later explained that once the association reviewed the documentation, there was very little left to debate. The county ownership records, the original surveys, the preserved boundary monuments, the historical aerial photographs, and the engineering measurements all pointed to exactly the same conclusion. The runway had never belonged to the Homeowners Association. It had always been part of my family's ranch. Within the following week, representatives for the association requested a formal meeting. I arrived carrying only one binder because there was no longer any need to overwhelm anyone with evidence. They already had complete copies of everything. Victoria Whitmore sat across the conference table, looking far different from the confident president I had watched speaking beside the community map. She remained professional throughout the discussion. She acknowledged that the documents presented by my attorney established ownership beyond any reasonable question and explained that the association intended to cooperate in resolving the situation. She also admitted that the current board had inherited many long-standing assumptions from previous leadership and that nobody serving today had independently verified where the landing strip actually existed before continuing community events there. Listening to her, I realized something important. Most of the homeowners had not intentionally decided to take someone else's land. They had trusted maps, newsletters, traditions, and the people who came before them. Unfortunately, confidence is not the same thing as proof. Over the next several weeks, contractors hired by the association removed every solar runway light from my pasture. The decorative welcome sign disappeared. Temporary fencing blocked the gravel access lane until restoration crews finished returning the field to its original condition. The compacted landing surface was carefully broken apart, fresh topsoil was spread across the area, and native grass was replanted before seasonal rain arrived. By early spring, the scars left by 4 years of airplane traffic had already begun blending back into the surrounding pasture. The only reminder of what had happened was the collection of survey monuments my grandfather had protected decades earlier. Those small pieces of steel had quietly outlasted every incorrect assumption built around them. A few months later, Walter and I stood near the same fence where he had first watched an airplane land, while believing I must have approved it. This time the pasture was silent except for the sound of wind moving through tall grass and cattle grazing peacefully across ground that finally looked like a ranch again instead of an airfield. Walter smiled before shaking his head. Hard to believe everyone thought they owned this. I looked toward the old boundary marker standing exactly where the original survey placed it more than half a century earlier. They never owned it, I answered. They only stopped checking. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the lesson my grandfather had tried to teach me long before I understood its value. Land remembers the truth even when people forget it. Fences can be replaced. Signs can be moved. Stories can grow larger every year they are repeated. But a carefully preserved record, backed by patience and verified facts, eventually speaks louder than any assumption ever could. My family did not win because we argued harder than anyone else. We won because the truth had been waiting in a filing cabinet since 1969, quietly proving that justice does not need to hurry when every fact already knows exactly where it belongs.